So, Edmund, thank you very much for coming to this podcast. And I must say that I read your book, Toward a Scientific Theory of Belief Systems, and I was very intrigued by it. And it's a book that I wanted to write, and you wrote it, and I'm glad. and and I thought of asking some questions regarding the book. I recommend for people to read the book itself. We won't go into the depths of the book itself, but I think it's good to hear its author a bit on a podcast, if that's okay. So, Edmund, first question: why are belief systems? Why should our listeners be interested in belief systems or view belief systems as important at all?
Well, I suppose it's obvious that in the world around us, people see the world in dramatically different ways. It might be your next door neighbors might believe in flying saucers or all kinds of different things. They might believe in extreme right politics or any number of different political, religious, they might believe in flat earth, they might believe in all kinds of things. And sometimes they act on those beliefs in ways that impact all of us. And so it would be good, I think, to have some understanding of what's going on, how it's possible that people look out at the world and see it so differently. I think there's a temptation sometimes to think that they don't really. To think that if somebody very strongly disagrees with me, then they don't really disagree, but they're either doing it as a provocation, they're trying to wind me up, or they're trying to dupe me. You know, they're consciously lying to make me believe, or they're saying it for effect or whatever. And all of those things can happen. But very often it really is the case that the people you walk past in the street see the world in ways that to you are very exotic. So I think for that reason, if for nothing else, belief systems are of interest.
Mm-hmm. So maybe piggybacking on what you said, and before we go into the more scientific approach in your book, do you feel that today belief systems, there was in the 70s talk about the end of ideology, people not believing, cynical reason, by this German philosopher, I forgot, Sloterdijk, people not really believing in what they're believing. Do you feel that we are in a new ideological age? Do you feel that, what is your take on how belief systems are mobilized today?
I mean, that's a very good question. I don't know whether I would say a new ideological age, because I don't know whether I would accept that people were ever really free of ideology or free of beliefs. It may be that for a certain time, and I think that is true, in the 1970s, as you say, people liked to, or the beliefs that were more in fashion at the time included the idea, well, I don't have these ideologies. Mm-hmm. It's something in a slightly different field from the one that you mentioned. If you look at the Church of England theology in the 1960s, it's full of people saying nobody now can believe that God created the world less than 10,000 years ago, or something like that. Not saying I, the author, do not believe it, but presenting it as a fact. No modern person, nobody alive now can believe these things. And obviously, in fact, there were plenty of people then who did. But nowadays, certainly, I think we'd be more hesitant to say that there's anything that people are incapable of believing. Young Earth creationism is very mild compared to some of the beliefs that are out there. So there are changes over time, and I don't think we wholly know what drives those changes in the sorts of beliefs that are fashionable or that fit the zeitgeist. I mean, I will give you just one example of a change that I think is very noticeable. Is that in 1914, when the Archduke Francis Ferdinand was assassinated at Sarajevo, which triggered the events that led up to the First World War. Maybe somebody did say this, but I have not heard that anybody then said, inside job, false flag, what you really believe it was Princip, you really believe it was Serbian nationalists. Obviously, this was Vienna court intrigue. The emperor wanted him dead. It was a put-up job. Francis Joseph did whatever the date of the assassination was. If it happened now, you would not be able to move for people saying that.
Wow. Yeah.
On the first day that a news story like that was reported, there would be people saying false flag. Surely you can't take this at face value. So that's a real change that's happened. Off the top of my head, I can't date it more precisely than that, but that's certainly something that's changed since 1914. And in that way, maybe some of the belief systems that are around now seem more obvious. It's more, or it should be more apparent that we need to look at this, that we need to study it, because very elaborated, very different belief systems crop up, and you get quite new beliefs like QAnon in the United States, beliefs surrounding that, which do have real adherents, and that's something that's come up quite quickly. So I think it would anyway be good, whether or not people end up concluding that I provide it, but it would be good to have some scientific understanding of these processes. And I don't claim anyway to have all the answers. I mean, that some of these changes in the zeitgeist, I don't feel I can explain.
Do you feel that the left has taught hermeneutics of suspicion to everybody, or?
It certainly seems that way. Although I don't know whether all of these things originate on I don't think it needs to come out of a leftist hermeneutics of suspicion. I think there are different forms. I mean, not wanting to sidetrack too much into Russian political affairs, but this is something that I study as well up to a point, is specifically Russian beliefs. And you get in the period following the collapse of the Soviet Union, kind of explosion of what you might call conspiracy theories. It's not a term that I particularly favor, but explanations of events in highly extravagant terms, with conspiracies, with aliens, with all sorts of things. The secret mission of the Soviet Union was to bring about immortality.
I thought that aliens was an American thing. I didn't know that it has like a Russian.
It's become in the post-Soviet period very, I would say, at least as highly developed in Russia as in America. But up to a point, the reasons for that, or the reasons for that development, I think, are quite straightforward. That this begins among people who regret the collapse of the Soviet Union, who look back on that as having been the good society, at least compared to what they're living through afterwards in the 1990s. But if you just say, well, let's get back to that, let's get back to when we had a wise Politburo guiding the affairs of society, then, well, if it was so good, how come it collapsed then?
Right.
If this was the good society, then why, when it did not lose a war, it was not overthrown by force? Why did it just dissolve itself? And the answer that people come up with is, well, there was something going on behind the scenes. There was Yeltsin was a CIA agent, or Gorbachev was this, that, and the other, or whatever it might be. The details are less important. But that move to say, well, it didn't really collapse, and I think that's something that people are always tempted to do if their political project seems to fail surprisingly or inexplicably, is to say we didn't really. People in the United States might think of the very one-sided attribution of Donald Trump's election victory to Russian hacking or Russian interference. I think part of what that's doing, not that people in Moscow didn't really hope Trump won and didn't support him through their media to the extent that they had that ability. But it's also a very comforting explanation.
Right.
Why did people, when they had the chance to vote the right way, why did enough of them nonetheless vote the wrong way? Is it that we did something wrong? Or is it that there are deeper problems? Well, no, it's because somebody meddled with it.
Right.
That's a much less that's a much less extreme example, but it's a similar process, I think.
Externalization because then you don't have to deal with deep problems with your belief system or society when you externalize.
Yes, exactly. You can identify, and I mean another Russian example, or and this is of it being done not sort of organically, but in state propaganda, was the treatment of Trotskyism in the propaganda of the Stalin period. That it was no longer possible to admit that something went wrong, or that this factory missed its target or something. It had to be deliberate sabotage. It had to be Trotskyist wreckers motivated purely by evil. There's a speech of Stalin's from the mid-30s, just as the purges were really getting going. I don't recall the exact date of it, but around that time, I think, where he says something like, 5 or 10 years ago, Trotskyism used to be a political viewpoint, but one that we disagreed with. But now it's become this sort of manic conspiracy that exists only to work evil. That's not quite the language that he uses, but effectively saying that. And of course, what's changed over that period isn't Trotskyism, but it's Stalinism. That 5 or 10 years ago, he was still prepared to, in some form, make a political argument. Whereas by the date of this speech, any opposition can only be demonic. And it has to be more and more all-embracing, because otherwise, how is it still there when we've been purging like crazy for years? How is it still popping up? So you have, that Trotsky is in a secret alliance with Britain and the Emperor of Japan. Completely implausible.
Right.
But things like that can happen spontaneously. People can follow that sort of thought process.
So there's an interesting question. When does something, a related question, when does something that, when does an explanation that we're used to, for example, explanations of ideology, that is that whatever society that we're in, its main belief systems service those in power, when does that exactly veer into conspiracy theory? What's the border there?
Well, as I say, conspiracy theory isn't, I think, a term that I'm completely happy with. But I think there you can draw a fairly good line by saying, do we think that the people themselves largely believe it? Do we think that the people in power themselves largely believe? Not, everybody tells lies sometimes. I do, and I'm sure political leaders do. But I think there's a big difference between saying people who have a lot of power and wealth find that the world looks to them in such a way that it's convincing that they ought to have that power and wealth. And saying that they know deep down that they shouldn't have it. And they make up these lies in order to dupe the masses. Well, I don't think largely they do make up lies. I think most of the time, if you could hear the billionaires and politicians speaking in private, I think they would speak in a similar way. And I thought that was something that was very revealing when the diplomatic cables and so on were released through WikiLeaks. That there was virtually nothing in that. Some of it might have been embarrassing and it was private for various reasons. But those people talk in private in exactly the same terms in which they talk in public. They absolutely do not say, well, now we're behind closed doors, we can drop the pretense, drop the way we put it out for the gullible masses, and we can tell it how it really is. Because by and large, they do believe things. Most people, most of the time, believe what they're saying. Or the assumption should be that people believe what they're saying unless you have specific reason to think that they don't. And sometimes you do have a specific reason. Sometimes it is clear that people are lying. Although even there, you can show that somebody's contradicted themselves. You can show that they say one thing to one audience and another thing to another. But even there, maybe, an example, this was some years ago now, but it's an example that stuck in my mind, was the Hungarian Prime Minister before Orbán, Ferenc Gyurcsány, After winning another term in the elections, he was recorded, not knowing that he was being recorded, speaking to his party colleagues or his parliamentary caucus or something, and talking about the election campaign, saying, my God, we lied and lied and lied. No government's ever lied the way we do, and it worked. And of course, this came out and people thought, well, there you are, you see, he was lying and lying. And perhaps in that instance he was. I mean, I'm not particularly trying to defend the honor of Ferenc Gyurcsány, but all we know is that he said one thing to the voters and another thing to his private party audience.
Right.
And it might be that the truth was somewhere in between.
Right.
That he did partly believe the things that he told the naive masses. I don't know in that particular case, but it seems to me that if you're talking to your kind of professionally cynical party operatives, you might play up the, we're all men of the world. We know that none of this is real. And that could be a bit of an act as well.
Right.
It's like in personal interactions, in day-to-day interactions.
Right.
If you
to show that you're savvy and that there is value to the in-group also.
Yes, exactly. Because if you only repeat the stump speech, if he'd said to the party audience exactly the same things that he'd have said if he'd known that the cameras were on him, then people think, well, what's the point of this?
Yeah. Why am I special? Right.
Yeah. So even there, you don't. But people do sometimes lie. I mean, I accept that people do sometimes lie, but they also, much more interestingly, they often really believe what they're saying.
Right.
There can be intermediate levels. Sometimes it is possible to say, well, you just don't act as though that were true.
Right.
You say you believe it. And I'll give an example of that would be that if you do an opinion poll in the United States at the moment, you would find millions upon millions of people who say they believe that Trump really won the last presidential election. Well, but you've got to stop and ask with that. Well, if there are millions of you and many of you are armed, why aren't you doing anything about it? If you really believe, if you really, not as a point of rhetoric, but you really believed that there had been some kind of coup and the election would be stolen, then you wouldn't be sitting around saying, yeah, but we'll take back the House at the midterms. You would be in the streets, or you would be in prison, or there would have been enormous numbers of people, more than there in fact were, for the riot at the Capitol, which was really quite a small, quite a small number of people. So you have to think that a lot of those people, well, it's not that they're as such lying, but when the poll asks them that question, they think, well, I know I like Trump, and I don't like Biden. So if you ask me a poll that says, do you like Trump or Biden? Then I'm going to say I like Trump. And if you ask me a poll that doesn't quite say that, but that clearly has a pro-Trump answer and an anti-Trump answer, then I'll give the pro-Trump answer.
Right.
Even if I might not literally quite
believe it. Yeah, true. Yeah.
Because I know that the people who are answering the other way are the liberals and Democrats and the left. I don't want anything to do with them. So yeah, damn it, Trump did win the election.
Right.
So you can sort of see how they get to saying it, and it's not a question of lying, but they don't quite, but they don't believe it literally.
Yeah.
and you see that a lot. It's not at all unique to that political world. You see it in politics, and you see possibly a related thing is people who might not really have a firm view one way or the other, but they know that what we're supposed to think. If I'm a liberal or a Christian or whatever else I might be, then there are certain questions where I know what the official answer is. I know what our side is supposed to think.
Yeah.
And so I might well say that if you ask me. This is one of several reasons why it's a bad idea to ask. I mean, I think in general, surveys and asking questions is not a good way to find out what people believe, because you're not getting their spontaneous expression. I mean, they might be lying to you. If they're lying to anybody else, they might well lie to a survey. I will try to be honest in my answers to the questions that you ask me now. But even today, talking to you, there might be questions that you'd ask me where I would think, blimey, if I really put my cards on the table, then the audience at home are going to think I'm nuts. So I'll just gently, I'll sidestep that particular question.
Right.
Thanks very much.
Right.
And all the more so if it's in an opinion poll, you don't want to keep saying don't know.
Right.
I mean, I always think an opinion poll claims to be a scientific device. It claims to be a kind of scientific.
Right.
But it really isn't scientific, because in that form of science, experimental science, there ought to be a control group.
Right.
And with an opinion poll, there isn't a control group,
right.
and it's difficult to set up something exactly like a control group. It takes some ingenuity. But I certainly always think when they're polling what people think about political candidates, they should include some people who are not running, or some entirely fictitious people. But I mean, again, and I don't want to keep talking about Donald Trump. I mean, but again, he's a sort of convenient example for this. That when there was first talk of him running for president, he immediately did very well in the polls among likely Republican primary voters. But that, I suspect, is purely name recognition, because you look down a list of about 20 names, and most of them were the governor of somewhere 10 years ago, and you don't really know anything about them. You might not even recognize the name. Then you see, oh, Donald Trump, I know him. I've seen him on the TV. I've always heard of him.
Right.
So you say him like if it were a poll on what's your favorite breakfast cereal. You might say cornflakes, because I've heard of that.
Right.
Half the brands I've never even heard of. Cornflakes, bang, cornflakes. Yeah. So, and then the fact that he was doing well in the polls boosted his campaign, made him look like a serious candidate.
Right.
And with that, it seems to me that it would be possible to include in the early days, when people don't know yet who's running, include, do another poll in parallel with a different group of people, and include a different celebrity who in fact is not running for president.
Right.
And who even has quite different views, to the extent that their views are known from Trump's views. And then we'd see, well, that's a sort of baseline level for people voting for name recognition. But anyhow, I mean, I don't mean to advise opinion polls because they know their business or they don't, and I suspect they don't. But I'm skeptical with regard to opinion polling in general.
Right. So maybe this is a good segue to another question, which is related. So your book offers looking at belief systems as connected, logically connected prepositions, mostly using something called descriptive logic, which I'd want you to elaborate. But before we go into describing what does descriptive logic look like, I want to look at two alternatives and see what you think about them. One alternative is that belief systems are more structured like stories and not or schemes or whatever, scripts, things which are narrative in character. Like a person who's religious maybe has the religious story of creation of the world, and then through the story, he or she creates a belief systems and then thinks what he believes. But first of all, they have a story and then they have a belief. Or someone who is a nationalist has, let's say, a story about the nation, and then through the way they tell the story of the nation, then they think about what their belief system are. So that's one option, which seems to me non-prepositional at its core, but kind of draws prepositions from a narrative base. Another kind of interesting structure to belief systems I saw, he's not a very good, I didn't feel he was very insightful. His name is, I think, Michael Frieden. I think he's responsible for the Oxford Handbook of Ideologies or something. And there he talked about central concepts that are more central or less central in our belief system. So let's say I'm a liberal, so freedom is important. If I'm a socialist, equality is important. If I'm a nationalist, identity is important. And I organize maybe the rest of, if let's say I believe in liberalism, I put freedom at the center, and then eventually I think about equality, but it's not like central for me. If I'm a nationalist, I feel that everyone should return to their own identity. And then, for example, I read Alexander Dugin the other day. He says something about social justice someplace, but it's really peripheral to his conception of what's important. So that's another arrangement. So maybe comment on these two alternative ways of organizing belief systems through concepts and through narrative before we go more deeply into the way you conceptualize them as propositional logic.
Right. I mean, I don't think either of those is completely incompatible with what I'm saying. Narrative or stories. I mean, certainly in the book, I use the word myth to refer to a story that's taken as being exemplary or typical or revelatory. So it tells us something about how the world is. And there are many belief systems that that have a large role for that kind of story. And there are others maybe where they play a smaller role. I mean, even in belief systems that you wouldn't obviously think of as being mythological, stories like that. And I think I define myth in that way because we often use the word myth conversationally to mean something that's not true. Right. That's just a myth.
Right.
Dawkins
also has a story, right, to tell us about how things develop and what. Yeah.
But I think we need to define it so that it's not. Right. My stories are just our true history, but your stories are just myths.
Myth, right?
So I say a myth as a as a story that's, as I say, that's exemplary or typical or whatever it might be. And you certainly see that. I mean, you see that on. And I'll give us an example of the Marxist left, which might, some Marxists might object if they were told that their belief system has mythic components. But the way that they think of, for not all Marxists, but the way, for example, many people on the Marxist left think of the history of the Russian Revolution and the power struggle after the death of Lenin and so on, and they take that as an example. What should we do now? You see this very much with people on the left, that with the Russian invasion of Ukraine now, some people go, oh right, war in Europe, that means it's 1914. That means, and I say this with some, I feel that impulse in myself as well, right. to respond like that.
Or 39.
Yeah. And that's the thing, you can put it into different
right.
Mythic frameworks. You
right.
can apply it to different stories. So I think stories are important in many belief systems, and that's convenient, or it might be tempting to emphasize that angle because we know stories relatively well anyway. We know how to think about narrative. So if you can think, if we can get it in terms of plot points and the development of the narrative and characters and a story arc and so on, then all of that is things that we know how to talk about, and we know how to think about. But still, how do we distinguish a story of that kind from any other story? How do we distinguish a story? I said we can't distinguish it by whether it really happened or not. Because the Russian Revolution did in some form really happen, but there might be myths that are equally important for other belief systems, and some of them really historically happened, and some of them didn't, and some of them it's not possible at this time to know. So we can't base it on that. Whereas I think what we can base it on is that as I said at the beginning of this little bit, that they are exemplary of something about how the world is, that they
right.
tell us something about how the world is.
Right.
In other words, they've got a propositional content.
Right.
They are a story with a moral, and a moral is a proposition. That it tells you that the world is a certain way, or you should act a certain way, or when you do this, then this will follow. That's what people use their myths for. And that's one of the ways in which myths are different from stories that might be told for entertainment or right. other kinds of stories, which are not so much about teaching a lesson. Right. But a myth is a story with a lesson. It's a story that you approach as having a lesson. Right. That you get the lesson from it. And that lesson is something that can be expressed propositionally. Right. So on that, I think there's no real, there isn't necessarily a contradiction between the two, but it doesn't get you to a belief system that's non-propositional. It just gets you to where the propositions are expressed as narrative, or as moments that we learn through a narrative, rather than being expressed in a a prose treatise,
Right.
or in sermons or speeches or ritual or various other forms that ideas can be expressed in. As for the other one, central concepts.
Perhaps before we move to the central concepts, I was wondering, sometimes philosophers, for example, like Hobbes, need to invent a story, or if you remember Plato in Protagoras, in the famous dialogue, they kind of invent a story. He needs to invent a story that there was a state of nature before civilization. And then he tells us a story in both these texts about how we moved from the state of nature to the state of civilization, and what needs to be, what follows from this narrative. Do you feel in such cases that the narrative is kind of superfluous, or that
I don't think it's superfluous.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's superfluous. I think,
or Rousseau, who tells us other stories.
Yes, I mean, I think what those writers are doing is, with some degree of consciousness, in the case of Plato, with total consciousness, they are inventing their own myth, like the myths that exist, that circulate in society as part of other belief systems. Plato even uses the word myth, and modern readers, it slightly stops up short when they find Plato saying, right then, now let's invent a myth. Because we think that you can't do that, that a myth is something sort of timeless, that it's something that is only a tradition. But of course, a myth can be invented. And I think that's what the writers who you mentioned are trying to do up to a point, is to create a story to reveal what the world is like, or what it under certain circumstances would be like. In the case of Hobbes, it's to say, why must there be an authoritative state? And one way that you can dramatize that is by saying, well, if there weren't, then it would be like this. So once upon a time there wasn't, and
look at how it was,
and that was worse, and that's how we came to create. And the author puts into the story the morals that he wants to be drawable out from the story.
Right.
For example, that the social contract in Hobbes is not a contract between us and the ruler. The ruler is not bound by very much. But we, all the rest of us, have agreed to subject ourselves to a common rule because we realized that was better, that the alternative was a state that we wouldn't wish to return to. So that's the way Hobbes thinks society works. And I should say, I'm a great admirer of Hobbes. I disagree with him about just about everything, but I think he's really head and shoulders above a lot of his contemporaries. I like Hobbes a lot. Although, as I say, I don't agree with any of his views, or even particularly his methods. But he's a very impressive writer, Hobbes. But what he's doing is he could express his opinions without a narrative component, without presenting it as this is what happened in history. But for whatever reason he chooses, or he feels that it's more convincing, or it sells it to say not just this is what would be if we didn't have the state, but this is how it was. This is something that that really happened, and that means that it could happen again, and so we need to be sure that we don't, etc., etc. So it isn't. I don't think it's superfluous, but it's part of an argument that's evolved in logical terms.
Sometimes it's embellished, like Freud and Totem and Taboo, as like a more elaborate story. The brothers came, they killed the father. Then after they internalized their guilt and created a more equal society. We have lots of these stories. Yeah, but as you say, they're constructed after the fact. Maybe also the biblical stories like that, that it knew what it wanted, or some of what it wanted to say before it told the story. For instance, that human existence is work is difficult, giving birth, like explaining basic things regarding human existence, and also relationship with authority and what it entails.
Yes, I think that certainly can be true. I mean, in the case of Bible stories, I wouldn't say it all goes one way, because some of that material is probably folklore, that's then been incorporated into what we eventually have as the Bible, and sometimes it's passed through different strands, which can create a more sometimes can make the text more interesting from a literary perspective than probably either it was originally. Like the portrayal of Saul in the books of Kings, as we now have it, is very nuanced. He's not unequivocally he's not a monster, and he's not a plaster saint.
Right.
But he changes, and he now behaves one way, now behaves another way. And the biblical criticism, slightly disappointing as well, it's because it comes from because there was a more pro-Saul strand in the tradition, and there was a more Davidic strand in the tradition, and they've been merged together, so we get different bits. But I think certainly there are examples in the Bible where a story has been created to make a point.
Right.
Perhaps more clearly than sometimes with Freud, because of course with Freud, because so much of his source material is accounts of his patients' dreams, so some of what he's working on is in narrative form anyway. And Freud is anyway a very fluent myth maker, or inventor of symbols. I mean, I don't think there are many writers who've influenced the way people think about their internal life, the way people discuss their mental life, that even people who do not take Freud seriously, really as a theorist, still to this day, I think, find it natural to talk about repression and false memories and unconscious and things that are part of the Freudian system.
Right.
But yes, I mean, totem and taboo, quite surprising the extent to which he thinks he's able to reconstruct specific events. But yes, that's in part a creation of a myth to point out elements of the doctrine.
Right. So let's go back to the other conception of belief systems that is based on concepts or central terms that articulate that around them kind of.
Yes, I mean, I suppose that probably, I would say, is a bit less fruitful than the narrative.
Yeah, I think
approach. So. Because if you've just got a concept or a term in isolation, what does it mean? What's it doing? You can say equality, but unless we see it in action, unless we've got some idea of what this term is being used for or where it comes from, then I don't think it gets us a huge distance further forward. And those examples that you gave are freedom or equality or whatever, are big abstractions,
right,
that can be interpreted in very different senses. So I don't think, I mean, we may well find that in a particular belief system, the idea of equality is highly valued or it plays a significant role, but it'll play that role in some sort of a context. And I would say it would be in a propositional context. It wouldn't just be the sort of luminous idea hanging there. Because if it's that, then you can really interpret it. I mean, equality of whom, with whom, in what respect? The equality of souls before God, or equality before the law, or the equal dignity of all living beings, whether sentient or non-sentient. There are people who believe in all of those things.
Right.
And they've all got the concept equality.
Right.
But they're doing quite different jobs. And so I think grouping those together and saying those are all versions of a belief in equality, well, I'm not sure that that gets you very much further forward. So I mean, the belief systems will have concepts that are important in them and concepts that are peripheral. But I don't think you can identify them just by saying, well, let's look for the key concepts then. And we decide that this belief system is all about freedom. I don't think in general that's the way forward.
Under specified.
Yes, I think so.
So I'm wondering regarding descriptive logic a bit. Where did you get the notion? Is it something that you took from somewhere or you invented? I really like it, and I'm wondering. I even looked it up and didn't find anything. I was wondering, it sounded like something that should exist, and I looked it up.
I thought so too. No, I mean, as such, no, I don't think I did get it from anywhere else. I mean,
nice.
This is the claim that a belief system has a logical structure, and so you can work out what that logical structure is. You can arrange the propositions, you can arrange the things that people believe. Something like a logical argument. Now, it might not be, not all the steps in it will be ones that you or I necessarily find convincing, but there is some sort of logic going on. Where I thought of the term descriptive logic was by analogy with linguistics or with the study of grammar, where you can have prescriptive or normative grammar, or you can also have descriptive.
Descriptive, right.
And normative or prescriptive grammar is that's probably what you want if you're trying to learn French.
Right.
You want to be told this is the right way to say it.
Right.
And you can get that for your own language as well. Things that a book that will tell you, don't split infinitives or whatever it might be. These are the rules, and if you want to speak and write correctly, and maybe the value of that for your own language might be questionable, but for learning a foreign language, it's indispensable to have the rules in a clear form. Mm-hmm. And if you don't say it like this, you're probably wrong. Right. But the correct way to say it is like this.
Right. Sometimes even you won't be understood.
Yes. Often you won't be understood. But that's what a prescriptive or a normative grammar book is doing, and that's a valuable thing to have. But there is also in linguistics descriptive linguistics or descriptive grammar, which tries to look at the way people actually speak, and to identify what the rules and the patterns and the regularities are. And that might say, well, no, it's fine to, not even it's fine, but that people very often do use constructions that the prescriptive textbook would say you shouldn't use. And they would say, well, the real grammar of English as we see it in use is the way people actually speak. So I'm applying something similar to logic.
Right.
The logic that we have various branches of the study of logic are normative. They're telling you how you must reason. That if you want to avoid contradiction, then this does follow from that and this doesn't. So if you accept that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then you've got to agree that Socrates is mortal. Of course, in real life, when they're talking about, when we're talking about things that we care passionately about, which in belief systems you often are, you're talking about God or the good society or things that people care about, then they don't always necessarily reason according to the rules of normative logic. And they might say something like, I don't know how many people have passionate beliefs about Socrates, but they might well say, well, yeah, all men are mortal, and yes, Socrates is a man. But Socrates can never die. Mm-hmm. So, okay, we don't, and the normative logician would just say, well, you've made a mistake, or there is a logical flaw, so your argument is null. It doesn't establish the thing that you hope it'll establish, and there's nothing much more to be said about it. Whereas what I'm suggesting is that we try to reconstruct what the reasoning actually is, and how people's beliefs make sense to them, which they do in general. And again, like I was saying, it's tempting sometimes to think that other people are just lying or whatever. And in general, we should not think that. It's tempting to think that people are illogical, or that other people's beliefs are just irrational.
Right. No, but I have a question regarding, like, when I live through a belief system, my subjective experience is that anything is good fodder for that belief system. There's nothing prior to, let's say I'm angry about capitalism. I might go in the street, this will bother me, that will bother me. It might start off with culture, and it might go to the workplace. And so there is like, and if I'm a religious person, for instance, also, my feeling from talking with religious people is, it's almost a belief system is like a spider's web that is just looking for things to feed it, essentially. And my experience is that I'm asking regarding the order. I'm not totally persuaded that there is. So on the one hand, I might like, when I'm thinking, I might ask like, what is the basic prepositions of Marxism? Is it even if I'm thinking seriously, I can start perhaps with the commodity, or I can start with class war, or I can start, or when you listen to the Dalai Lama or something, you might start with compassion, and next you'll start with desires, or when you're listening to a sermon in Christianity, they can start from this, from a small line that they took from the Bible, and then they'll go. So it seems like belief systems are kind of organized in a way that allows a fluidity of orders, and not necessarily one order. Even the example that you give of Dawkins, I imagine Dawkins can start with being pissed off that people believe in God. The next day he might start with survival, with a principle of survival of the fittest, so there is like, I'm wondering regarding order inside the belief systems.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly once a belief system is in existence, logical relationships are there, then yes, you can flow backwards and forwards within it. And Dawkins might well wake up one morning and feel more annoyed about people believing in God than he feels thrilled by contemplating natural selection. But to say that's where he started from gets you into difficulties, because
what about the example, for example, of Marxism, that in Capital he starts with commodity, and let's say in the manifesto he would start with class war, like or class conflict. Like, how are we to say like this is more fundamental than that? I myself don't know which one is.
No, well, I mean, in that I would say things can be fundamental in different ways.
Okay.
Capital does not claim to be starting from does not claim to be presenting first the most important thing, mm-hmm. and deducing other things from it. I mean, I don't think for a minute Marx really thought that the most important thing in the world was how many yards of linen can be exchanged for one coat.
Right.
But for purposes of exposition or for building up the argument, you start at a certain point and you develop the argument, mm-hmm. from that, for the particular purpose of describing how the commodity form works, and then bringing that into a description of how building that up into a description of how the capitalist economy works. And some of the same material, some of the same ground which is covered in earlier works or manuscripts of Marx, like the Grundrisse, are done in it might be argued in a different direction. Mm-hmm. And this, I think, is something that Marx is quite familiar with that, going back to Hegel, that in Hegel, if you compare the phenomenology of spirit and the science of logic, the science of logic is presenting the system starting from its most simple beginning, which is just being, and aims to show how you can derive everything else starting from that beginning. It's not claiming that that's how Hegel himself worked it out or how anybody else could have worked it out. But this shows the whole thing in an orderly form, starting from the simplest beginning. Whereas the phenomenology of spirit starts from, right, well, what can you see in front of you? So that's meant to be much more the idealized progression of how you would think of the system, how you start by reflecting on what you can see, and that leads you to further reflections and further developments. So it's the same up to a point Hegelian system, but you can approach it from different ends for different purposes of exposition. And once the system is in existence, you can, up to a point, start it from anywhere. But there are propositions that Marxists are keen to defend, and that if they are challenged, or if they're challenged within Marxism, if the Bernstein-Kautsky controversy, or Bernstein-Kautsky-Luxemburger, however you want to think about it. Bernstein is saying that capitalism might not lead to communism, that there isn't that historical direction. That caused furious argument and long polemics on both sides, and so on. So it's clearly touching on something that is felt by all concerned to be central. And so those propositions that are being challenged by Bernstein, the argument may then ramify out to other things. But there are all sorts of other books and articles and speeches from around the same time by people in the parties of the Second International, agreeing or disagreeing with this, that, or the other that they'd read in Engels. If somebody says, "Oh, I don't think the dialectics of nature idea is up to much," that tends not to to cause an enormous argument. And I think you can often see, if you can look at a belief system and see that there's a lot of work going on to show, for example, how two propositions that might seem to contradict each other don't really contradict each other. A very classic example of that would be in Christianity, the belief that Jesus is God and man, which would seem to be contradictory. But the first 400 years or 500 years, whatever it is, of Christianity consists of a lot of work going on, establishing exactly how it's possible to uphold both of those things at once. Well, if only one of them had mattered very much, and the other one had been disposable, then wouldn't you just dispose of it? If you've got one thing that you're very sure is true, and another thing that could also be true, and they seem to be contradict, and they seem to contradict, then all other things being equal, you would want to get rid of you would want to remove the contradiction. If neither of them was important, then you might still believe both of them because you wouldn't really notice the contradiction because you wouldn't spend enough time thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
But then you wouldn't get these long creedal formulations defining exactly how it's meant to fit together. So when you get something like that, then I think you can say, well, this is something that this is something where both of those carried a great deal of weight within the belief system, and other things could be brought into alignment with those ideas. It isn't always very easy to see, and often there will be possible there will be a variety of reconstructions possible, or people will differ about how they interpret a given belief system. But it should then be possible to have that debate in a rational form by saying this reconstruction, how do you then account for the fact that they believe X, Y, and Z? So in the case of Dawkins, if we think he starts by being annoyed with religion, then why does he always bring up natural selection as an example?
Maybe he started being annoyed. We can imagine a Dawkins that was annoyed with religion and then looked for a weapon for something to battle religion, and then
yes, you can. Yes, you absolutely can. I mean,
and you can imagine a scientist, another kind of person, who starts as a biologist, let's say, doing evolutionary theory, and then looking outside in society and seeing all these people, all these crazy people believing whatever creationism, and then he starts. So how do we establish like biographically we know which one Dawkins is probably, or but like in terms of a belief system, how do we? I like your idea of looking at places where there is a lot of work being done as places that establish basic propositions regarding the belief system. I think that's a good heuristic to looking at it, but still, I think the order itself.
Well, you can also, by the same token, you can look at places where no work is being done.
Okay.
As I suggested, where it's just not felt to matter very much.
Right.
Now, Dawkins is hardly bothered about defining the boundaries of religion.
Right.
He is very lackadaisical about, Buddhism, I don't even know whether that counts as a religion or not. And that I think helps you to home in on the fact that it's specifically monotheist creation stories that he doesn't like. And then you can look, in the case of Dawkins, there is the quality and the manner of the exposition, that when he's talking about animals and plants, he's eloquent, he's clearly passionate, he's got lots of different examples. When he's talking about religion, he's sort of snippy and irritating. And I think it leads you to, if you assume that the natural selection thing comes first, then that would lead you to think, well, it won't just be religion that he won't like. but he'll be against other things that might distract people from contemplating how wonderful natural selection is. If we're assuming that it starts with a strong sense of how explanatory and compelling natural selection is. And we do find just that in Dawkins. And he talks somewhere about going to a lecture about the fig in literature and art. And he was furious that the lecturer didn't talk about the evolutionary element, that they didn't talk about how the fig is symbiotic with the wasp or something. That's what's interesting about the fig. What are you wasting time with these paintings and books? Well, it was advertised as a talk about the fig in art.
Right.
And you might, and you'd have thought that you would go along knowing what you were expecting. If you're not interested in the question, don't go to the lecture. But he's very interested in the fig. But the natural selection angle, the Darwinian angle, is so compelling to him that even somebody just talking about something else. I very much doubt he doesn't say that the lecturer ever said, you don't want to be interested in any of that evolutionary rubbish. The good thing about figs is this painting that they're in. And I very much doubt that the lecturer did say that.
Right.
So they weren't arguing against his position at all. They were just talking about something else. And that was already enough to wind him up. Because they're distracting people. They're getting people to think about all this other stuff when they could be thinking about natural selection, which is the really good thing.
Right.
And that's like somebody who's a sincere, passionate believer in anything. You could easily have religious people like that.
Right. Or Marxists.
Who would go along to a talk, or Marxists like that.
Why aren't they talking about the class and the fig?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Even if it wasn't, that wasn't on the card, that wasn't advertised. But they would think, forget that, the really interesting thing is my thing.
Right.
And that, I think, comes out clearly in that Dawkins story. And that that I think is a pretty strong pointer that natural selection is that's the driving force of that belief system. It still could be. Now, if you were saying he starts with religion and he picks up natural selection instrumentally, that it's a weapon that he's going to use against the belief in God, and that's perfectly plausible. There are a lot, and not just plausible, that exists. There are atheists in that category who are atheists first and foremost, and they pick up arguments about natural selection that they wouldn't otherwise be interested in.
Right.
But they don't often then become as lyrical about it as Dawkins is. You can very often tell Dawkins has lots of other opinions about biology and about natural selection. He has internal arguments within biology.
Right.
He has lots of other opinions about evolution that aren't directly related to the criticism of religion. I don't think he has lots of opinions about religion that are not directly related to the evolutionary.
That's nice.
Criticism.
Yeah.
And that's often quite a good point. Is somebody who believes in 9/11 truth, to take that as an example, who thinks that the 9/11 attacks were an inside job, or that the planes were detonated, the towers were detonated by a controlled explosion. They might put forward arguments that are to do with structural engineering, or, well, jet fuel doesn't burn hot enough to melt structural steel. But they don't have any other opinions about civil engineering. And they're not interested in it in any other context. But they do have other opinions about government cover-ups and things of that nature. So you can tell from that, really, where the center of gravity is and which of these doctrines is probably. And then they present what they believe is a good argument. And I use the term belief advisedly, because people don't necessarily, I suspect quite a lot of Marxists, a much bigger thing in their politics than they would be keen to admit would be ethical or moral considerations, that they find capitalism to be unjust, and that socialism offers a prospect for a morally better social order than the one that we're living in now. But of course, within the logic of Marxism, that is not a good reason for believing something. Marxism doesn't generally attach a lot of weight to moral or ethical considerations. So somebody might well say, well, I believe it because I find the theory of surplus value convincing. Because even if in fact they're driven more by ethical or moral considerations. Now, we might well be able to see how that works itself out, that if somebody challenges on a technical point of Marxist economics, or if there are debates within Marxism on points of economics, I think, well, the transformation problem, I don't care too much really about the transformation problem. The important thing is to reduce the amount of avoidable suffering. So I think but it's not unique to Marxism. I mean, in lots of belief systems, perhaps all belief systems, but certainly lots of belief systems include ideas about what makes a good reason for believing in that. And so once you do believe in it, you'll sincerely think that that's the foot that you put forward, because that's the good reason for believing it. And you will probably believe that that's why you believe it. I don't think people always have a lot of insight necessarily into what the structuring logical relationships among their own beliefs are. Or at least the way you know it of yourself is quite similar to the way you know it of other people, by seeing what are the things that you work to avoid the contradiction, what are the things that you ignore, and so on and so forth. But yes, I mean, it shouldn't surprise us that people put forward And that, incidentally, I mean, that is why sometimes you can feel that the person you're talking to is unreasonable, or is illogical, or it's one way that can come about. That if you're talking to somebody who believes in 9/11 truth, or if a religious person were debating with Dawkins, then they might feel that, well, I keep answering the points that he's making when he talks about religion, but it just bounces right off him, and he comes straight back with another argument. And he doesn't even seem interested.
Mm-hmm.
But that's because the things that are really motivating him are the Darwinian material. And similarly with 9/11 truth. If I don't think that 9/11 was an inside job, and I'm arguing with somebody who does, I can try and rebut their point about steel and say, well, it doesn't need to completely melt to turn to liquid, at a much lower temperature it softens, and then etc. etc. But I won't make any impression on them, because that's not why they believe it in the first place. They're offering that as an argument. But if all I do is rebut that, then I'm not touching on any of the things that really make them believe the things that they're saying. So of course I won't persuade them. It's not that they have no logic, it's that it's not coming up in the discussion.
Okay, Edmund, I was thinking, I have many, many more questions. Perhaps we should meet a second time and discuss them. Would that be good for you? Because we're already...
Yeah, happy to do that.
Yeah, that would be great, because I have questions on ideologies today, and on many other things, on relationship between ideologies and belief systems and experience that you covered in the book, and material conceptions. So I think I don't want to tire you too much. You've been talking for an hour and a half. Thank you very much. I've learned a lot, and I really enjoyed talking with you.
Oh, well, thank you. I enjoyed it as well.
Excellent. So have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Bye.